You know you've officially made it as a suburban villain when your hate mail comes laminated? Not just put in a plastic sleeve, mind you. I'm talking heat-sealed, bubble-free, rounded-corner professional lamination. It was stuck under the windshield wiper of my truck, glistening in the aggressive 7 a.m. sunlight, like a beacon of passive aggression. I stood there in my driveway, coffee mug in one hand, car keys in the other, staring at it. The font was Comic Sans. Of course it was Comic Sans. It was the typography of choice for bake sales, lost cat posters, and unhinged neighborhood threats. I pulled the note free. It had a satisfying snap to it, stiff as a dinner plate. "Attention resident," it read, centered and bolded. "It has been observed that your vehicle is discharging toxic fluids onto the community pavement. This is a direct violation of HOA Bylaw 14.2, Aesthetic Integrity of Shared Surfaces, and a biohazard. Remedy this immediately or further action will be taken." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. There was only one person in the Whispering Pines subdivision who owned a laminator, a laser tape measure, and a soul seemingly fueled by the misery of others. Mrs. Higgins. I looked across the street. Her house was a fortress of beige conformity. The lawn was cut to a military standard 2 inches. The petunias were arranged by color gradient. And there she was, standing by her front window, the blinds tilted open exactly enough to accommodate one peering eye. As soon as I looked up, the blinds snapped shut. "Morning to you too, Satan," I muttered, taking a sip of coffee. I looked down at the toxic discharge in question. I knelt by the front tire of my 2019 Ford F-150. It wasn't a junker. It wasn't a pristine showroom princess. But I took care of it. I did my own oil changes. I rotated the tires. I treated that truck better than I treated my own lower back. There, on the asphalt, was a spot. A dark, terrifying spot, roughly the size of a Ritz cracker. I touched it with my index finger. It was cold. It was thin. I rubbed it between my thumb and finger. It didn't feel like 10W30. It didn't feel like transmission fluid. It felt like wet. I brought my finger to my nose and sniffed. Nothing. No chemical tang, no burning smell, just the faint scent of asphalt and morning dew. It was water and condensation from the air conditioning unit running full blast yesterday afternoon because we live in a state where the humidity tries to drown you simply for walking to the mailbox. "You have got to be kidding me," I said to the empty driveway. I stood up, peeling the laminate note off my finger where it had momentarily stuck. I considered walking across the street and knocking on her door, but that was a rookie mistake. Mrs. Higgins thrived on confrontation. She fed on it like an energy vampire. If I went over there, I'd be trapped in a 40-minute lecture about the proper depth of mulch or the exact shade of acceptable grade for mailbox posts. Instead, I decided to play it cool. I crumpled the note, which was difficult, given the structural integrity of the lamination, and tossed it into my truck. I'd deal with it later. I had to get to work. I backed out of the driveway, making sure to drive painfully slowly past her house, giving a friendly wave to the closed blinds. By the time I got home that evening, I had forgotten about the note. My day had been a parade of minor annoyances. Clients who wanted to pay in exposure, suppliers who were 2 weeks out on parts that were supposedly in stock, and a sandwich that was 90% bread. I just wanted to crack a beer, watch a game, and exist in silence. But the suburbs do not sleep. The suburbs wait. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw her. Mrs. Higgins was patrolling the perimeter of her property line like a warden at Alcatraz. She was wearing her combat uniform, khaki shorts that flared out like a tent, a polo shirt tucked in with aggressive tightness, and a visor that was large enough to land a drone on. She was armed with a garden hose, but she wasn't watering anything. She was just holding it, nozzle set to jet, waiting. I turned off the truck. The AC compressor gave a final shudder and shut down. Drip, I heard it. A single drop of condensation hitting the concrete. It was the sound of my doom. I stepped out. "Evening, Mrs. Higgins," I called out, aiming for breezy but landing somewhere near exhausted. She didn't return the greeting. She marched, actually marched, knees high, to the edge of the curb. She stopped exactly 1 inch from where my property line began. She knew the boundaries better than the county surveyor. "You didn't remedy the situation," she said. Her voice was like a cheese grater on aluminum foil. "The situation?" I asked, leaning against the door of my truck. "The leak," she said. Pointing the hose nozzle at my front tire, like a silencer. "The hydrocarbon discharge. It's still happening, I can hear it." "Mrs. Higgins," I said, channeling every ounce of patience my mother had tried to instill in me. "It's water. It's condensation from the air conditioner. It's 90 degrees out. The truck is sweating. I'm sweating. The pavement is sweating. It's just water." She narrowed her eyes. "That is exactly what someone hiding a catastrophic engine failure would say. Do you know what oil does to asphalt, Mr. Miller?" She used my last name like an insult. "I assume it stains it," I said. "It dissolves the binding agents," she cried out, clutching her pearls, metaphorically, though she was actually wearing a lanyard with a whistle on it. "It eats through the seal coat. It seeps into the groundwater. It lowers property values. Do you want to be responsible for the collapse of the Whispering Pines housing market?" "I think the market can withstand a teaspoon of H2O, I said. "Look, I'll show you." I walked around the front of the truck and knelt down again. The spot from this morning had evaporated. Gone. Vanished. Because, and I cannot stress this enough, it was water. "See," I pointed to the dry concrete. "Evaporation. The science. If it were oil, it would still be there." Mrs. Higgins didn't look at the ground. She looked at me with a pitying sneer. "The wind probably blew the dust over it, concealing the toxin. It's soaking in deep. It's probably hitting the bedrock by now." "The bedrock?" I stood up, dusting off my knees. "Mrs. Higgins, my truck is not fracking the driveway." "I have logged the incident," she said, pulling a small, Shota waterproof notebook from her pocket. She clicked a pen with terrifying authority. "Second observation, 6:15 p.m. Subject is defensive. Refuses to acknowledge environmental terrorism." Terrorism? That feels like a stretch. "The bylaws are clear," she recited, not looking up from her writing. "Section 14, paragraph 2. No vehicle shall discharge fluids of any kind upon the community roadways or private driveways visible from the street. Fluids of any kind, Mr. Miller. It does not specify viscosity." "It implies fluids that aren't water," I argued. "Does that mean if it rains on my truck and the water drips off, I'm in violation?" She stopped writing. She looked up at me, and for a second I saw a flicker of genuine calculation in her eyes. She was actually considering if she could find God for rain. "Rain is an act of God," she said finally. "Your truck sweating because of poor maintenance is an act of negligence. It's not maintenance, it's physics. Air conditioners make water." "Fix it," she snapped, turning on her heel with military precision. "Or the board will fix it for you." She marched back to her petunias, turned on the hose, and began blasting a single dandelion with enough pressure to strip paint. I went inside and drank 3 beers. 2 days passed. I thought I had won. The spot continued to appear and disappear in the rhythm of the day, a harmless cycle of hydration and evaporation. I started parking slightly to the left, just to vary the pattern. I even considered putting a little pan underneath it to catch the water, like a dog bowl, but I figured misses. Higgins would report me for harboring standing water conducive to mosquito breeding. Then, the letter arrived. It wasn't a laminated note this time. It was a thick, creamy envelope with the official gold foil crest of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It looked like a wedding invitation, if the wedding was between a bureaucrat and a demon. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Notice of violation. RE, 402 Oakwood Lane. Violation, persistent discharge of hazardous fluids. Failure to remediate after verbal warning. Fine, $250. Additional action required. Professional cleaning of affected concrete surface within 48 hours. I stared at the number. $250. For water. I felt a vein in my forehead start to throb. It was a specific vein, one that only woke up when I was dealing with cable companies or the HOA. I grabbed my phone and walked out to the driveway. I took a picture of the concrete. It was bone dry. I took a picture of my finger touching the concrete. I took a video of myself drinking a glass of water, then pouring a little on the ground, then narrating, "Look, it's the same thing." I sent an email to the HOA board. I attached the photos. I wrote a calm, rational explanation detailing the mechanics of condensation, citing 3 automotive websites and offering to have a mechanic sign an affidavit stating my truck was not leaking oil. 3 hours later, I got a reply. "Dear Mr. Miller, the board has reviewed your appeal. However, Mrs. Higgins has provided photographic evidence of the stain in question, as well as a sworn statement regarding the persistent nature of the discharge. Furthermore, she notes that the fluid has a suspicious sheen, consistent with synthetic lubricants. The fine stands. Please remit payment by Friday to avoid late fees. Sincerely, Greg from the board." I knew Greg. Greg was a guy who once asked me if my grass was a little too green and if I was using unapproved nitrates. Greg was Mrs. Higgins' puppet. I looked out the window. It was getting dark. The streetlights were flickering on. Across the cul-de-sac, Mrs. Higgins' house was glowing with the warm, smug light of victory. I could see her silhouette moving past the window. She was probably laminating my check before I even wrote it. I wasn't going to pay. I would sell the house before I paid $250 for water. But I couldn't ignore it either. If I didn't pay, they'd put a lien on the house. They'd escalate. They'd start fining me for the color of my curtains or the expression on my face. I needed a strategy. I needed to fight fire with fire. Or, in this case, water with water. I walked outside. The air was thick and humid. My truck, faithful beast that it was, had left a fresh spot of water on the driveway. I crouched down and looked at it. "Suspicious sheen," I muttered. "Give me a break." Then I saw it. Mrs. Higgins was out there again. It was 9:30 p.m. She was walking her dog, a nervous little creature that looked like a rat that had been through a dryer cycle. She stopped right in front of my driveway. She pulled out a flashlight, a high-lumen tactical flashlight. She shone it directly onto the wet spot under my truck. "Aha," she whispered. It was loud enough for me to hear from the porch. "Still leaking." I stepped out of the shadows. "Mrs. Higgins!" She jumped, swinging the beam into my eyes. "Jesus, you scared me!" "You're trespassing," I said, shielding my eyes. "I am on the public sidewalk," she countered instantly. "And I am documenting a hazard. Look at that shine, Mr. Miller. That is classic 10W40. It's practically glowing." "It's reflecting your flashlight," I said, "because water is reflective." "It's a slip hazard," she declared. "Someone could walk up your driveway, slip on this slick, oily mess, and break a hip. I'm doing this for your liability protection." "Who is walking up my driveway at 9:30 at night besides you?" "Delivery people. Emergency services. Me, when I have to come leave another note because you refuse to comply." She shone the light on the spot again. "You know, if you don't clean this up, I'm going to have to call the authorities. This is an environmental issue. The EPA takes runoff very seriously." "You're going to call the EPA?" I laughed. "On a puddle?" "I'm going to call the police," she said, her voice dropping to a sinister register. "Public safety hazard. Reckless endangerment." "Go ahead," I said. I was bluffing. I didn't want the cops here, but I was tired. "Call the SWAT team, Brenda. Tell them I'm harboring a fugitive puddle." She clicked her flashlight off. "Don't test me, Mr. Miller. I have the precinct captain on speed dial." She tugged the nervous dog and marched away into the night. I stood there, fuming. I looked at the spot. It really was just a tiny, harmless wet spot. But in her mind, it was the Exxon Valdez. I went back inside, sat at my computer, and opened the HOA bylaws PDF. I had downloaded it a year ago when they tried to fine me for leaving a pumpkin out past November 1st. It was November 2nd. I hit Ctrl+F and searched for cleaning. I read through the legalese. Section 12, Noise Ordinances. Section 13, Exterior Maintenance. Section 14, Hazardous Materials. And then I found it. The paragraph that would change my life. Section 14.3. Remediation of hazardous spills. In the event of a reported hazardous fluid leak, oil, gas, chemical, the homeowner is required to remediate the stain immediately upon notification to prevent permanent staining or environmental contamination. Immediate remediation takes precedence over standard noise restrictions if the spill is deemed active and spreading by a reporting member. I read it again. Immediate remediation takes precedence over standard noise restrictions. I sat back in my chair. A slow, wicked smile spread across my face. She had reported it as active and spreading. She had emphasized the slip hazard. She had demanded I fix it immediately. I looked at the clock. It was 10 p.m. Too early. Amateurs work at 10 p.m. If I was going to do this, I needed supplies. I needed firepower. A garden hose wasn't going to cut it. If she wanted the driveway cleaned, I was going to clean the driveway. I was going to clean it so hard it would forget it was ever concrete. I grabbed my keys. The 24-hour equipment rental place was across town. "Hang on, Brenda," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to show you how it's done." I hadn't even made it to the truck door before the cul-de-sac was bathed in a strobe light display of red and blue. It was a silent disco of authority. 2 police cruisers, not 1 but 2, rolled up the street, killing their sirens just before they hit the turn, creating an eerie, pulsating silence. I froze, keys in hand. Surely this wasn't for me. Maybe there was a hostage situation 3 streets over. Maybe someone was running a meth lab in a basement. Maybe Mrs. Higgins had finally snapped and taken a mailman prisoner, but no. The lead cruiser pulled up directly perpendicular to my driveway, blocking me in. The second one parked strategically behind it, ensuring that if my water-leaking F-150 decided to make a run for the border, it would have nowhere to go. Mrs. Higgins emerged from the darkness of her porch like a general inspecting the troops. She pointed a trembling finger at my house. "That's him!" she screeched. "The polluter!" A police officer stepped out of the first car. He looked to be in his late 40s, with the weary, heavy-lidded expression of a man who had seen everything from grisly murders to cats stuck in ATMs, and had decided that none of it was worth the paperwork. His name tag read Miller. "Sir," Officer Miller said, hitching up his belt. "Step away from the vehicle." "It's my vehicle," I said, holding up my hands. "I live here." "We received a call regarding a hazardous chemical discharge and a potential domestic disturbance," Miller said, walking up the driveway. He didn't have his hand on his gun, which was a good sign, but he did have his hand on his flashlight, which he clicked on and aimed directly at my chest. "Domestic disturbance?" I blinked. "I live alone. Unless you count the spider in the guest bathroom, there's nobody to disturb." The caller stated you were shouting aggressively at the pavement, Miller said, checking a small notepad. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. She was standing at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, beaming with the radiant energy of a woman who has finally spoken to the manager of the universe. "I was disputing a claim, officer," I said. "And I wasn't shouting. I was projecting. There's a difference." "And the chemical discharge?" "Come look," I said, gesturing to the spot. Officer Miller walked over. A second officer, a younger guy who looked like he was 12 and hoping for a shootout, joined him. They stood over the terrified little patch of damp concrete. Miller shined his light on it. He squatted down. He poked it with a pen. "It's wet," Miller observed. "It's condensation," I said, "from the AC." "It smells like asphalt," Miller said. "Because it's on asphalt," I pointed out. "He's lying," Mrs. Higgins yelled from 20 feet away. "It's synthetic. It's odorless toxic sludge. He's trying to kill the groundwater." Miller sighed. It was a long, deep sigh that seemed to deflate his entire upper body. He stood up and turned to Mrs. Higgins. "Ma'am, please stay on your property. We are conducting an investigation." He turned back to me. "Look, Mr. Miller? Same name. No relation, I hope." "I hope not," I said. "Mr. Miller, here's the deal. She called 911. She told dispatch that you were releasing flammable toxins and that you were erratic. We had to come out. I understand that, but But you can see it's water, right? Miller looked at the spot again. Then he looked at my truck. Then he looked at me. He leaned in close, dropping his voice to a whisper. Between you and me? I know it's water. I've got a Chevy that pisses coolant every time it sees a hill. But technically, I'm not a chemist. And technically, she's citing a public safety hazard. So what happens now? Well, Miller said, scratching his chin, I can't arrest you for a wet driveway. But because a complaint was lodged about a slip hazard on a surface accessible to emergency personnel, which is what she called it, I have to issue a warning. You need to remediate the hazard. Remediate the hazard, I repeated. You want me to dry my driveway? I want you to make her stop calling us, Miller said, his eyes pleading. This is the third time this week she's called. Monday it was a suspiciously parked van that turned out to be an Amazon driver having lunch. Tuesday it was a drone spying on her bathroom, which was actually a large moth on her window screen. Tonight it's the Valdez spill here. He tore a slip of pink paper from his book. This is a warning of non-compliance regarding potential surface hazards. It carries no fine, but it's a paper trail. It basically says we told you to clean it up. I took the slip. It felt heavy in my hand. So, I have to clean it, I said. Technically, Miller said, glancing back at the younger officer who was now checking his phone. The code says that any reported hazard on a roadway or driveway must be addressed. Once you clean it, the hazard is gone, and we close the ticket. Okay, I said. I'll clean it. I'll clean the hell out of it. Miller chuckled. Don't go crazy. Just, I don't know, hose it down? Throw some kitty litter on it? Just make it look like you did something so I can tell dispatch it's resolved. Officer Miller, I asked, a thought forming in the back of my brain, a jagged, dangerous thought. Is there a time limit on this remediation? Like, do I have to wait until morning? Miller shrugged. Safety doesn't have a schedule, buddy. If it's a hazard, it's a hazard. The city code actually says environmental hazards are supposed to be dealt with immediately upon discovery to prevent seeping. If you want to go out here with a roll of paper towels right now, be my guest. Just keep it down, yeah? Immediate remediation, I whispered, to prevent seeping. Exactly, Miller said. He clapped me on the shoulder. Good luck, Miller. Try not to let her get to you. She reported a cloud last week because it looked threatening. The officers got back in their cars. The lights died. The silence returned. I stood there holding the pink slip. I looked across the street. Mrs. Higgins was still watching. She gave me a smug little nod, a nod that said, I own you, and went inside. I didn't go to the rental store immediately. That would be impulsive. Impulsive gets you caught. Calculated gets you legends. I went inside and made a pot of coffee. It was 11:15 p.m. I sat at my kitchen table, the pink police warning on one side of my laptop, the laminated hate mail on the other. I opened the HOA bylaws again. I also opened the city municipal code, peering through the digital pages like a forensic accountant looking for a tax shelter. I needed to be bulletproof. I found the noise ordinance first. Section 8.1, Quiet Hours. Quiet hours within the residential zone are defined as 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. During these hours, no machinery exceeding 65 decibels shall be operated. That was the hurdle. A pressure washer, a real pressure washer, runs at about 90 to 100 decibels. That's louder than a lawnmower. That's standing next to a motorcycle, loud. If I fired that up at 3 a.m., I'd be breaking the law. Unless. I scrolled down. There it was. Section 8.4, Exceptions to Noise Ordinance. The following activities are exempt from the noise restrictions set forth in Section 8.1. A. Emergency vehicle sirens. B. Municipal maintenance. C. Emergency repair or remediation of property necessary to prevent immediate structural damage, environmental contamination, or threat to public safety. I froze. I read it again. Remediation, necessary to prevent environmental contamination. I pulled up the HOA bylaws, section 14.3. I reread the clause I had found earlier. Homeowners must remediate hazardous fluid leaks immediately, regardless of time of day, To prevent staining. I looked at the pink police slip. Nature of violation. Potential slip. Hazard. Environmental contaminant. Action required. Immediate remediation. The trifecta. The holy trinity of petty revenge. Mrs. Higgins had defined the spot as an environmental contaminant. The police had ordered immediate remediation. The city code exempted emergency remediation from noise laws. I wasn't allowed to wait until morning. Waiting until morning would be negligent. If I waited, the toxins might seep into the bedrock. They might dissolve the Earth's crust. Mrs. Higgins herself said it was spreading. By law, I was obligated to clean my driveway right now. And since the contaminant was so stubborn, according to her, a garden hose wouldn't do. I needed industrial equipment. I needed to ensure that every molecule of that non-existent oil was obliterated. But I needed one more thing. I needed to make sure I wasn't just cleaning my driveway. I looked at the photos I had taken earlier. The driveway sloped. It sloped down towards the street, and the street crowned slightly, directing runoff. Where? I went to the window. I looked at the topography of the cul-de-sac. If I used enough water, high pressure, high volume water, the runoff would flow down my drive, hit the curb, and if I angled it just right, it would pool directly in front of Mrs. Higgins' pristine, whitewashed, award-winning driveway apron. And if her driveway was contaminated by my runoff, well, I would be a terrible neighbor if I didn't clean that up for her too, right? I needed a bigger boat, or rather, a bigger washer. I spent the next hour researching. I didn't want the little electric unit you buy at Home Depot to wash your patio furniture. I wanted the contractor special. I wanted something that required ear protection and a liability waiver. I found a 24-hour equipment rental place called Big Mike's Heavy Hire, about 20 minutes away. Their website was terrible. Black background, yellow text, flaming GIFs, but their inventory was beautiful. The Tsunami 9000, 4,200 psi, 4.0 gallons per minute. Honda GX 390, engine. Features, surface cleaner attachment. The spinning disc of doom. Description, removes paint, grease, oil, rust, and bad decisions. It was perfect. But before I left, I needed to set the stage. I needed to make sure that when the chaos started, I was unassailable. I drafted a document. I titled it Emergency Remediation Plan, 402 Oakwood Lane. I listed the timeline of events. 1. Discovery of hazard by neighbor, Mrs. Higgins. 2. Confirmation of hazard by law enforcement, Officer Miller. 3. Order for immediate remediation. 4. Selection of appropriate equipment to ensure total removal of persistent synthetic sheen. I printed it out. I stapled the police warning to it. I stapled Mrs. Higgins' laminated note to it. I put the whole packet in a clipboard. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired. I looked like a man who had been pushed too far by the tyranny of a laminated note. I changed clothes. I didn't want to look like a guy in his pajamas having a breakdown. I wanted to look like a professional handling a crisis. I put on my heavy work boots. I put on old jeans. I put on a high-visibility yellow vest that I kept in the truck for emergencies. If you wear a high-vis vest, nobody questions you. It's the urban camouflage of the working man. You can carry a ladder into the Pentagon if you're wearing a high-vis vest. I grabbed my keys. It was 12:30 a.m. The streets were empty. The subdivision was silent. Mrs. Higgins' house was dark, save for the single amber glow of her porch light, watching over the neighborhood like the eye of Sauron. "Sleep tight, Brenda," I whispered as I climbed into the truck. "The cleaning crew is coming." As I backed out, carefully avoiding the wet spot, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was about freedom. This was about every person who had ever received a passive-aggressive note about their trash cans being out 10 minutes too long. This was for the people who had been told their mailbox shade was too aggressive. I was going to scrub this cul-de-sac so clean they'd be able to see their sins in the reflection. I hit the gas. The truck roared. Next stop, Big Mike's. The drive to the industrial district was a blur of anticipation. I rehearsed what I would say if I got pulled over. "Officer, I am on an emergency sanitation run." It sounded insane. It was insane, but it was also legally sound, which is the best kind of insane. I pulled into the lot of Big Mike's heavy hire. It was a fenced-in yard surrounded by razor wire, illuminated by floodlights that hummed with electricity. The air smelled of diesel and grease. It was beautiful. I walked into the small office. It smelled like stale coffee and sawdust. Behind the counter sat a man who could only be Big Mike. He was shaped like a vending machine made of meat. He had a beard that looked like it could stop a circular saw, and he was watching a rerun of Ice Road Truckers on a tiny TV. He looked up as I entered. He took in the high-vis vest. He nodded. "Help you?" His voice sounded like gravel tumbling in a dryer. "I need a pressure washer," I said, "and not the electric kind. I have a stubborn situation." Mike leaned back, the chair groaning in protest. "Stubborn like my deck has algae? Or stubborn like I need to erase a crime scene? Stubborn like my neighbor thinks water is toxic sludge and the HOA is threatening to foreclose on my house if I don't sanitize the earth immediately," I said. Mike stared at me for a long second. Then a slow grin spread across his face, revealing a gold tooth. "Ah," he said, "the HOA special. I know it well." He stood up. He was at least 6'4". "You want the Tsunami?" "I saw it on the website. Is it loud?" "Son," Mike said, walking out from behind the counter, "it has a Honda engine big enough to power a go-kart. It doesn't hum, it screams. It's got 4,200 psi. That's enough pressure to cut a brisket. If you aim it at your foot, you won't have a foot. You'll have a stump." "Perfect," I said. "I'll take it." "You got a trailer?" "I have a truck bed." "We'll ramp it up. You need detergent?" "I need the strongest, foamiest, most industrial-smelling soap you have. I want it to smell like cleanliness and vengeance." Mike laughed. It was a booming sound. "I got just the stuff. It's called Concrete Jungle. It's biodegradable, but it smells like pine trees and chemical warfare. It foams up white as snow. Load me up." We walked out to the yard. The Tsunami 9000 sat there on its cart, gleaming under the floodlights. It looked less like a cleaning tool and more like a weapon of mass destruction. It had 4 heavy-duty tires, a reel of hose thick enough to strangle a python, and a wand that looked like a rifle. Mike patted the engine. "She's a beast. You know how to use a surface cleaner?" He pointed to a large yellow plastic disc attachment. "This is the flying saucer. You hook this to the wand. It spins 2 nozzles underneath at 3,000 RPM. It hovers on a cushion of water. It cleans a 20-inch path in one pass. No streaks, just pure, unadulterated clean." "I love it," I said. "One thing," Mike said, looking at me seriously. "You wear goggles and boots. This thing kicks up debris. You don't want a pebble in your eye at 200 miles an hour." "I'm ready." We loaded the machine into the back of my F-150. It barely fit. I strapped it down with enough ratchet straps to hold a tank. I went back inside to sign the paperwork. "Duration of rental?" Mike asked, hovering his pen over the form. "1 day," I said, "but I'll probably be done by sunrise." Mike looked at the clock. It was 1:15 a.m. He looked at me. He connected the dots. "You doing this now?" "Emergency remediation," I said. "City code." Mike snorted. He handed me the pen. "You're a legend, kid. Godspeed." I signed the waiver. I paid the deposit. I walked out to my truck, feeling the weight of the moment. I wasn't just a man with a pressure washer. I was an instrument of karma. I drove back towards Whispering Pines. The Tsunami 9000 rattled in the bed behind me, a caged beast waiting to be unleashed. I pulled into my street. It was 1:45 a.m. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the crunch of my tires on the asphalt. I parked. I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, listening to the peace. It was a fragile thing, this peace. It was built on a foundation of repressed anger and laminated notes. It was fake. I was about to shatter it. I got out of the truck. I lowered the tailgate. I set up the ramps. It was time to clean. I stood at the foot of my driveway, staring up at the Tsunami 9000 resting in the bed of my truck. Under the harsh glare of the street lamp, the machine looked less like a cleaning tool and more like something designed to terraform Mars. The yellow powder-coated frame gleamed with menace. The Honda engine block was the size of a microwave oven. The tires were knobby and aggressive, ready to crush any dandelion foolish enough to cross their path. Big Mike hadn't been kidding about the weight. When I'd signed the waiver, which, upon reflection, had included a clause indemnifying Big Mike's heavy hire against hearing loss, structural damage to concrete, and loss of friendships, he had insisted on giving me a crash course in the parking lot. Flashback to 30 minutes ago. "Listen to me," Mike had shouted over the idling engine of the beast, which he had started just to prove it worked. The sound was a guttural, earth-shaking thrum that vibrated in my teeth. "This ain't your daddy's electric sprayer. You respect the pressure. Don, or the pressure respects you right into the ER." He had pointed a gloved finger at the unloader valve, a brass knob that looked innocent enough. "This here adjusts your PSI," he explained, his voice taking on the reverence of a bomb disposal expert. "You crank it all the way down, you're peeling paint. You crank it all the way up, you're etching your initials into the bedrock. For a driveway, you want the sweet spot right here." He made a mark with a Sharpie. "Don't go past the line unless you hate the concrete." "I hate the oil," I had yelled back. "Good, hate is fuel," Mike had grinned. "Now, the tips. You got your red tip, that's 0 degrees. Do not use the red tip. The red tip is a laser beam of water. It will slice through a boot. It will slice through a tire. If you aim it at a window, you don't have a window anymore. You use the green tip, 25 degrees. Or the yellow, 15. Since you're dealing with oil, go yellow. It cuts deep." "What about the surface cleaner?" I asked, gesturing to the UFO-shaped attachment. "The Whirlybird," Mike nodded. "She's a beauty. You hook her up, you pull the trigger, and you hold on. It's got no wheels. It hovers. It's like walking a pit bull that's trying to chase a squirrel on ice. You guide it. Don't fight it. Let the water do the work." He had handed me a pair of earmuffs. "And for God's sake, wear these. Your neighbors are going to hate you regardless, but at least you won't be deaf." Back to the present. I looked at the house across the street. Dark, silent. The enemy slept, dreaming of bylaws and fines. I looked at my watch. 2:15 a.m. I had 45 minutes before my self-imposed H hour. The immediate remediation clause didn't specify a start time, but there was something poetic about 3 a.m. It was the witching hour, the hour of the wolf, the hour when the suburbs were at their most vulnerable. I lowered the tailgate. The metal groaned. I pulled out the aluminum ramps Mike had rented me. They clanged against the pavement, a sound that rang out like a bell in the silent night. I froze. I looked at Mrs. Higgins's window. Nothing. No movement. I carefully maneuvered the Tsunami 9000 down the ramps. It was heavy, a dead weight of steel and gasoline. I had to lean back, digging my heels into the asphalt to keep it from rushing down and crushing me. I felt like Sisyphus, if Sisyphus was really petty and into power tools. The tires hit the driveway with a solid thud. Horrid. I wheeled it into position, right at the top of the drive, near the garage door. This was the high ground. From here I could command the entire battlefield. Next came the hoses. Mike had given me 50 feet of high-pressure hose. It was stiff, black, and reinforced with steel braiding. It coiled like a snake that refused to be charmed. I wrestled it across the concrete, laying it out in wide loops to prevent kinks. Then, the water supply. I unspooled my garden hose. It looked pathetic compared to the industrial gear, a thin green vein of domestic weakness connecting to a heart of industrial power. I screwed it into the inlet valve of the Tsunami. I tightened it with pliers. No leaks allowed. I went to the spigot on the side of the house. I turned the handle. The pipes groaned and water rushed into the system. I walked back to the machine. I checked the oil. Clean. I checked the gas. Full. I checked the detergent tank. "Concrete jungle," I whispered, reading the label on the gallon jug Mike had sold me. Warning: may cause eye irritation, may cause skin irritation, may cause extreme satisfaction. Okay, I imagined the last part. I poured the thick, blue liquid into the soap reservoir. It smelled like bleach, and pine needles had a baby in a chemical factory. It was the smell of a hospital operating room, if the surgery was being performed by a lumberjack. Now for the PPE. I went into the garage and changed. I put on my heaviest work boots. I put on thick canvas pants. I kept the high-vis vest because safety first. I put on safety goggles. I put on the heavy-duty earmuffs Mike had given me, but I didn't pull them over my ears yet. I needed to hear the silence one last time. 2:45 a.m. I was ready. But something was missing. The staging. If I was going to do this, I had to do it right. I couldn't just be a guy cleaning a driveway. I had to be a hazardous materials response team. I went to the shelf where I kept my painting supplies. I found a roll of blue painter's tape. No, too subtle. I dug deeper. Caution tape. I had a roll left over from a Halloween party 3 years ago. Bright yellow. Caution, do not enter. I walked down to the bottom of the driveway. I tied one end of the tape to my mailbox post. I walked across the driveway and tied the other end to the decorative lamppost. I stood back. It was perfect. A yellow line of demarcation. It screamed, "Official business!" It screamed, "Danger!" It screamed, "I am insane!" Tiens, do not approach. I walked back up the driveway. I looked at the oil spot. It was still there, faithfully damp from the AC unit, which was still humming away. "You're going down," I told the spot. I picked up the wand. It was heavy, a solid piece of steel with a trigger guard. I clicked the Whirlybird surface cleaner into the quick connect socket at the end of the lance. It locked in with a satisfying shunk. I was holding a weapon that shot water, yes, but a weapon nonetheless. I checked the time. 2:58 a.m. I looked at the document packet on the hood of my truck. The police warning, the bylaw printout, the emergency remediation plan. I took a deep breath. The air was cool and still. Crickets were chirping. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I put the earmuffs on. The world went muffled and quiet. The crickets vanished. The wind became a dull thrum. I reached for the starter cord. This was the moment of no return. Once I pulled this cord, there was no going back. The noise would wake the dead. It would definitely wake Mrs. Higgins. It would probably wake the people in the next zip code. But the law was on my side. The pink slip in my pocket was my shield. The immediate remediation clause was my sword. I wrapped my hand around the handle. I planted my feet. "For the aesthetic integrity of shared surfaces," I whispered. I pulled. The engine sputtered and died. Panic flared in my chest. Had Mike sold me a dud? Was the universe conspiring against my vengeance? I checked the choke. It was off. I flipped it to start. I pulled again. Ka-chunk, chunk, chunk, roar! The Tsunami 9000 roared to life. It didn't just start. It exploded into existence. The sound was incredible. Even through the earmuffs, I could feel it in my chest. It was a deep, guttural bellow, a mechanical dragon waking up. The vibration traveled up through the soles of my boots. I looked at the house across the street. Light. Instantly. The bedroom light in Mrs. Higgins' house snapped on like a flashbang. I grinned. I squeezed the trigger on the wand. Whoosh! The water hit the surface cleaner. The disc lifted off the concrete, hovering on a cushion of high-pressure fury. A cloud of white foam, the concrete jungle, erupted from the edges of the disc, instantly covering the driveway in a blanket of chemical snow. I pushed the disc forward. It glided effortlessly. Behind it, a stripe of concrete appeared. But not just concrete, new concrete. Concrete that looked like it had been poured 5 minutes ago. It was blindingly, impossibly clean. I moved the wand back and forth. The machine roared. The water hissed. The foam expanded. I was doing it. I was scrubbing the driveway. I was scrubbing the oil. I was scrubbing the very concept of dirt from existence. And then, I saw her. Mrs. Higgins burst out of her front door. She was wearing a silk robe that looked like it cost more than my truck, and fuzzy slippers. Her hair was in curlers. She looked like a furious, pastel-colored storm cloud. She was screaming. I couldn't hear her, of course. The Tsunami 9000 was singing the song of its people at 105 decibels. But I could see her mouth moving. I could see the cords in her neck straining. She was pointing at me. She was pointing at the sky. She was pointing at her watch. I kept cleaning. I didn't look up. I focused intensely on the concrete. I was a professional. I had a job to do. She marched down her driveway. She marched across the street. She marched right up to the yellow caution tape. She stopped. She grabbed the tape and tried to rip it down. It stretched, but didn't break. I turned. I looked at her. I pointed to my earmuffs. I shook my head. Can't hear you, Brenda. Safety first. She was vibrating with rage. She looked like she was about to explode. She reached into her robe pocket and pulled out her phone. The police, again. Good. Let them come. I had my paperwork. I had my high-vis vest. I had the law. I gave her a thumbs up. A big, enthusiastic, "We're making progress!" Thumbs up. She threw her hands in the air and started furiously tapping on her screen. I turned back to the driveway. I had cleared the top section. The oil spot was gone. It had been obliterated in the first pass. But I wasn't done. The contaminant could have spread. It could have flowed downhill. I pushed the surface cleaner further down the drive. The foam flowed with me. A river of white suds began to trickle down the slope, carrying with it years of dirt, grime, and the shattered peace of the neighborhood. I watched the runoff. It hit the curb. It turned right. And just as gravity and the street grading intended, it began to flow across the asphalt, creating a foamy, bubbling bridge directly towards the driveway of 401 Oakwood Lane, Mrs. Higgins' driveway. I watched as the soapy water pooled against her pristine, manicured apron. "Oh no," I said to myself, my voice lost in the roar of the engine. "Containment breach." I looked at Mrs. Higgins. She was still on the phone, her back to her own driveway. She didn't see the suds invading her territory. I stopped the machine for a second. The sudden silence was deafening. "Ma'am!" I shouted. She spun around, phone to her ear. "You are in violation of... Look out!" I pointed to her feet. She looked down. The soapy water was creeping over the toes of her fuzzy slippers. She shrieked, a high, piercing sound that cut through the night. She jumped back. "It's spreading!" I yelled. "The toxins are spreading!" "You did this!" she screamed. "You are flooding the street!" "It's the runoff!" I yelled back, channeling my inner disaster movie hero. "The containment has failed. It's heading for your property. I have to intercept it." "Do not you dare touch my driveway!" "I have no choice!" I shouted, grabbing the wand. "It's an environmental emergency, paragraph 3. Immediate remediation. I have to save your concrete." I squeezed the trigger again. The engine roared back to life. I stepped over the caution tape. I stepped onto the public road. I wasn't just cleaning my driveway anymore. I was on a mission. I pushed the surface cleaner across the street, pushing a wave of water ahead of me. I hit the base of her driveway. "No!" she screamed, chasing after me, but keeping a safe distance from the spraying water. "I'm saving it!" I yelled. I pushed the disc onto her driveway. The water hit her concrete. And that's when I saw it. Her driveway was clean. But it wasn't Big Mike clean. It was garden hose and broom clean. As the Tsunami 9000 passed over her concrete, it stripped away a layer of gray film she probably didn't even know was there. It revealed a blindingly white surface underneath. I left a stripe. A perfect 20-inch wide stripe of virgin concrete right up the center of her driveway apron. It looked like a scar. A beautiful, clean scar. If I stopped now, her driveway would look ridiculous. It would have a racing stripe. "Oh, God," she wailed, realizing what was happening. "It doesn't match. It doesn't match." "I have to finish," I shouted. "I can't leave it uneven. The bylaws, aesthetics." I didn't wait for permission. I pivoted. I swung the machine left. I swung it right. I was painting with water. I was an artist of erosion. The sirens wailed in the distance. They were coming back. Officer Miller was returning. I smiled. I kept cleaning. I had about 3 minutes before they arrived. I could get at least half her driveway done by then. This was the best $250 I had ever spent. The world was water, noise, and white foam. There is a specific kind of trance you enter when operating heavy machinery that is actively destroying something. It's a dissociative state. I wasn't me anymore. I wasn't a guy who worked in IT and worried about his cholesterol. I was an instrument of purification. I was the Poseidon of the suburbs. The Tsunami 9000 bucked and kicked in my hands, fighting the sheer torque of the water pressure, but I held the Whirlybird surface cleaner flat against Mrs. Higgins' driveway. The difference in color was staggering. Her driveway, which she claimed was the gold standard of the neighborhood, was actually a filthy, shameful shade of charcoal gray. My machine was peeling back that lie to reveal the blinding, bone-white concrete beneath. It was satisfying. Too deeply, primitively satisfying, like popping a zit the size of a Buick. I had cut 3 distinct stripes up the length of her driveway apron before the blue lights reflected off the wet pavement. The sirens cut out, but the visual chaos remained. The strobe lights danced in the mist that hung over the cul-de-sac like a low-hanging fog. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. You don't stop a masterpiece in the middle of a brushstroke. Then I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. I didn't jump. I expected this. I slowly released the trigger. The roar of the engine didn't die. It just dropped to a menacing idle, a thug, 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 thug that sounded like a helicopter waiting for extraction. The hiss of the water vanished. I turned around. Officer Miller was there. He looked different than he had 2 hours ago. He looked older. His hat was slightly askew. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who realized that his pension was still 12 years away, and he wasn't sure he was going to make it. Next to him stood Mrs. Higgins. She was vibrating, literally vibrating. The sequins on her slippers were shimmering from the frequency of her rage. I lifted one side of my earmuffs. "Arrest him! Tase him! Shoot the tires!" Mrs. Higgins was screaming. She wasn't using sentences anymore. She was just firing keywords into the night air. "Kill the engine, Mr. Miller," Officer Miller said. He didn't shout. He just mouthed the words, his voice flat. I reached down and flipped the kill switch. The Tsunami 9000 gave one last shudder and died. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a physical weight. The crickets were too terrified to chirp. The only sound was the dripping of water and the ragged, hyperventilating breathing of Mrs. Higgins. "Good evening again, officer," I said, my voice ringing too loud in the sudden quiet. I adjusted my high-vis vest. "Lovely night for remediation." "He's destroying my property!" Mrs. Higgins shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the zebra-striped monstrosity that was now her driveway. "Look at it! He vandalized it! He's stripping the finish!" "I am cleaning it," I corrected, stepping back to admire the contrast. "And might I say, Mrs. Higgins, you really let this place go. The grime buildup was significant. Have you been sealing it annually?" "You possess no right!" she spat. "Trespassing, vandalism, malicious mischief!" She turned to Officer Miller, grabbing his sleeve. "Arrest him. I want him in cuffs. I want that machine impounded." "I want his house seized." Officer Miller gently removed her hand from his uniform. He pinched the bridge of his nose. He took a long, slow breath, inhaling the scent of concrete jungle detergent, which now hung thick in the air, a smell like a pine forest engaging in chemical warfare. "Mr. Miller," the officer said, opening his eyes, "can you explain to me, in simple terms, why you are pressure washing your neighbor's driveway at 3:15 in the morning? And keep in mind, my patience is currently thinner than that layer of soap." "Absolutely, officer." I walked over to the truck hood. I picked up my clipboard. I walked back, my boots squelching in the soapy runoff. "If you recall," I began, using my best boardroom presentation voice, "at approximately 11:30 p.m., you issued me a verbal warning and a written notice, which I have here attached as Exhibit A, regarding a slip hazard and environmental contaminant on my property." Miller looked at the clipboard. "I remember." "You instructed me to remediate the hazard," I continued, and citing the city municipal code regarding environmental leaks, Exhibit B, I was required to do so immediately to prevent seepage into the groundwater. I believe your exact words were, "Safety doesn't have a schedule." Miller's eye twitched, just a little. "I did say that." "So," I gestured to my pristine, wet driveway. "I rented the appropriate industrial equipment to ensure total removal of the synthetic toxins Mrs. Higgins identified. I began the cleaning process. However, I paused for dramatic effect. I pointed to the gutter. Gravity is a harsh mistress. Wagi, officer. As I cleaned my driveway, the runoff, containing the dissolved toxins and the cleaning solution, flowed downhill. I traced the line of the water with my finger. It flowed perfectly from my drive, along the curb, and pooled directly in the dip in front of Mrs. Higgins's house. The contaminant breached the containment zone, I said gravely. It washed onto Mrs. Higgins' driveway apron. Per the HOA bylaws. Exhibit C, Section 14.2, a homeowner is responsible for any runoff that affects a neighbor's property. I looked Mrs. Higgins dead in the eye. I couldn't just leave a puddle of toxic sludge on your property, Brenda. That would be irresponsible. That would be a slip hazard. You could have come out here to get the mail, slipped, and sued me. I was legally obligated to mitigate the secondary hazard. Mrs. Higgins opened her mouth. Cool? She closed it. She looked at the clipboard. She looked at the water. She looked at Officer Miller. He's lying, she finally managed, though the volume had dropped. He did it on purpose. He aimed it at my house. I aimed it at the dirt, I said. The water goes where gravity takes it. Officer Miller looked at the clipboard. He flipped through the pages. He saw the highlighted sections of the noise ordinance exception for emergency remediation. He saw the highlighted section of the HOA bylaws regarding immediate action. He looked at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was respect? No, it was the weary camaraderie of a man who appreciates a well-constructed trap. So, Miller said slowly, you're saying that in order to comply with her complaint about your driveway, you had to clean her driveway. Exactly, I said. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor, officer. It's costing me a fortune in gas and rental fees, but safety is priceless. Miller looked at Mrs. Higgins. Ma'am, he's got you there. What? Mrs. Higgins screeched. It was a sound that likely woke dogs in the next county. You are taking his side? He is using a jet engine in the middle of the night. It's an emergency remediation, Miller quoted from my clipboard. Exempt from noise ordinances. But look at it. She gestured to the driveway. He ruined it. It's striped. It looks like a zebra crossing. We all looked at the driveway. She was right. It looked terrible. The Tsunami 9000 had cut 3 wide, blindingly clean paths through the accumulated grime of the years. The contrast made the dirty sections look black. It looked like the driveway was wearing prison bars. It does look unfinished, Miller admitted. I was interrupted, I said, looking at my fingernails. I was trying to restore the aesthetic uniformity required by Bylaw 12.1, but I was ordered to stop. I looked at Miller. Technically, officer, if I leave it like this, I am in violation of the Visual Blight Ordinance. Leaving a half-cleaned project is a finable offense. Mrs. Higgins writes people up for that all the time. I smiled at her. Right, Brenda. Remember when the Johnsons started painting their fence and stopped for a weekend because of rain? You fined them $50 a day for unsightly maintenance in progress. Mrs. Higgins went pale. She remembered. She had laminated that fine herself. So, I said, turning back to the cop. I'm in a bind, officer. I want to comply with your order to stop the noise, but if I stop, I'm leaving a visual blight and a potential chemical residue on her property, which opens me up to civil liability and HOA fines. I really feel like I should finish the job, for the good of the community. Officer Miller looked at the Tsunami 9000. He looked at the half-cleaned driveway. He looked at Mrs. Higgins, whose face was cycling through colors like a mood ring. Miller sighed. He handed me back the clipboard. How long? Miller asked. To finish the apron? 10 minutes, I lied. It would take 20, but I worked fast. You have 10 minutes, Miller said. No! Mrs. Higgins lunged forward. You can't let him. Ma'am, Miller said, stepping in front of her. He has a permit for the equipment. He has a paper trail for the emergency. And honestly, if he leaves it like that, I'm going to have to write you a ticket for having an unsightly driveway. It looks like a crime scene. He turned to me. 10 minutes. If I get one more call after that, I'm impounding the machine and I'm taking you in for disturbing the peace. Loopholes be damned. Understood, officer. Miller turned to his partner, the young guy who was hiding a smile behind his hand. Let's wait in the car. We'll supervise. They walked back to the cruisers. They didn't turn on the lights. They just sat there, the engines idling, watching the show. I turned to Mrs. Higgins. She was standing alone on her lawn. The wind blew her silk robe around her like the cape of a defeated villain. "You," she hissed, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated loathing. "You are the devil." "I'm just the cleaning lady," I said. "To!" I put my earmuffs back on. I walked back to the machine. I grabbed the starter cord. I looked at her one last time. I winked. "Ka-chunk roar!" The beast woke up again. The sound shattered the truce. I grabbed the wand. I stepped back onto her driveway. This was the victory lap. I didn't just clean, I performed. I moved the surface cleaner with the grace of a figure skater. I watched the grime vanish. I watched the years of her judgment, her pettiness, her laminated notes, all washing away into the gutter. The concrete jungle foam piled up high, looking like a bubble bath gone wrong. I finished the apron. It was blindingly white. It was perfect. But I had 5 minutes left. I looked up the driveway, towards her garage. The apron was the only part technically affected by the runoff. But the contrast between the clean apron and the dirty main driveway was now even more jarring. It looked like she was wearing a tuxedo jacket with sweatpants. I looked at the cruisers. Miller was drinking a coffee. He wasn't watching the clock. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. She had retreated to her porch. She was sitting on a wicker chair, her head in her hands. I stepped over the line. I moved up the main driveway. "I'm doing you a favor," I shouted inside my own head. "I'm increasing your property value." I pushed the machine faster. The Tsunami 9000 ate the dirt. I was sweating now. The steam from the hot engine mixed with the cold mist of the spray. My arms ached from the vibration. My boots were soaked. I smelled like industrial pine and gasoline. I felt alive. I cleaned around her decorative planters. I cleaned around her mailbox. I cleaned the walkway to her front door. I was unstoppable. I was the angel of abrasion. At the 9-minute mark, I cut the engine. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I stood in the middle of her driveway. It was transformed. It was the cleanest surface on earth. It glowed in the moonlight. Officer Miller flashed his headlights. One long flash. Time's up. I waved. I disconnected the hose. I rolled the hose up. I grabbed the Tsunami 9000 by the handle. I looked at Mrs. Higgins on the porch. She hadn't moved. She was just staring at the concrete. She looked small. "You're welcome," I called out. She didn't respond. She just lifted one hand and waved it dismissively, a gesture of absolute surrender. I wheeled the machine back across the street. It clattered over the asphalt. I pushed it up my own driveway. Nanny! Which was also sparkling clean. I loaded the beast back into the truck. It took the last of my strength. I strapped it down. The police cruisers pulled away. They rolled slowly down the street, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a moment. It was 3:45 a.m. The neighborhood was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the treaty has been signed. I looked at my driveway. I looked at hers. They were twins now. Two beacons of cleanliness in a dirty world. I walked to my front door. I stopped and looked at the spot where the laminated note had been on my truck earlier. I went inside. I peeled off my wet clothes. I threw them in the washer. I went to the kitchen. I opened the fridge. I took out a beer. "It's 4 a.m., I said to the dog, who didn't exist. "But I've earned this." I took a sip. It tasted like victory. But the war wasn't over. The war is never over. But for tonight, the battle of the driveway was won. I went to the window to close the blinds. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins was still sitting on her porch. She wasn't moving. She was just staring at her driveway. Then, she stood up. She walked down the steps. She walked onto the concrete. She looked down at her slippers. She took them off. She took a tentative step onto the wet, clean concrete with her bare foot. She wiggled her toes. She walked in a small circle. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out her laser tape measure. She measured the width of the cleaning path I had made. She stood up. She looked at my house. She nodded. Just once. A sharp, curt nod. She turned around and went inside. I closed the blinds. The sun hit my bedroom window like a physical blow. It was the aggressive, judgmental sunlight of late morning, specifically 11:30 a.m. I hadn't slept that late since college, or maybe since the flu of 2018. I rolled over, and my body reminded me that I was a 34-year-old IT professional, not a stevedore. My shoulders screamed. My lower back felt like it had been replaced with a bag of gravel. My hands, still curled into claw shapes from gripping the pressure washer wand for 2 hours, refused to straighten fully. I groaned, sat up, and cracked my neck. The memory of the previous night washed over me in a fever dream of noise, foam, and blue police lights. Did I really do that? I asked the empty room. I looked at the chair in the corner where I had dumped my clothes. The high-vis vest was draped over the back. Stiff with dried soap and mud. The boots were still wet. Yeah, I really did that. I shambled to the kitchen and made coffee. I needed the strongest stuff I had. I stood at the counter, waiting for the brew, afraid to look out the front window. What if it looked terrible? What if, in the cold light of day, I had just vandalized the neighborhood? What if Mrs. Higgins was currently out there with a lawyer and a hazmat team? I took a sip of coffee, braced myself, and walked to the living room. I approached the window like a soldier peering over a trench. I pulled back the blinds. Holy mother of pearl, I whispered. The world outside was HD. It was 4K. It was retina searingly bright. My driveway wasn't just clean. It was radiant. It was a slab of white marble dropped into a sea of suburban gray. It looked like it belonged to a celestial palace, not a 3-bedroom ranch. But that wasn't the spectacle. The spectacle was across the street. Mrs. Higgins' driveway was blinding. It was so clean it looked wet. It reflected the blue sky. The contrast between her driveway and the sidewalk, which I hadn't cleaned, was so sharp it looked like a Photoshop error. And there were people. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered. There was old Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down, leaning on his cane, pointing at the concrete. There was the young couple from the corner, holding their baby, staring with open mouths. A delivery driver had actually stopped his van and was taking a picture. It wasn't a crime scene. It was an art installation. I realized with a jolt of panic that my truck was still parked in the street because I hadn't wanted to drive on the wet concrete last night. The oil spot, the catalyst for this entire war, was visible on the asphalt. It was dry. It was gone. It had been scrubbed into oblivion. I decided I had to face the music. I put on sunglasses, necessary given the glare, and opened the front door. The humidity hit me, but so did the smell. The air still carried a faint, lingering scent of concrete jungle, pine and bleach. It smelled like victory. "Morning," Mr. Henderson called out. He waved his cane at me. "Miller, what in God's name did you do?" I walked down the path. "Little spring cleaning, Mr. Henderson." "Spring cleaning?" He laughed, a wheezing sound. "You stripped 20 years off the pavement, son." I haven't seen concrete that white since the subdivision was built in '98. Did you use a laser? Just a little elbow grease and high pressure, I said modestly. And you did Brenda's too? The young mom asked, bouncing her baby. It looks amazing. It makes our house look like a dump. It was an environmental necessity, I said, keeping a straight face. Runoff management. The front door of 401 Oakwood Lane opened. The chatter stopped. The neighbors instinctively took a half step back. Mrs. Higgins stepped out. She wasn't wearing the robe. She was in full battle rattle. Beige slacks, floral blouse, visor. But something was different. Her shoulders weren't squared. Her chin wasn't jutting out. She looked contemplative. She walked down her front steps. She didn't look at the neighbors. She looked at her feet. She watched her white sneakers moving against the white concrete. She walked to the edge of the driveway, where the pristine white met the dingy gray of the public road. She looked up and saw me. The neighbors held their breath. This was the showdown. Mrs. Higgins marched across the street. She didn't stop at the property line. She walked right up to me. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was tight, like a piano wire about to snap. "Mrs. Higgins," I nodded. She took a deep breath. She looked back at her house. She looked at the way the sun gleamed off the surface I had spent an hour agonizing over. "I have just finished a call with my realtor," she said. I braced myself. "Here comes the lawsuit," I thought. "She informed me," Mrs. Higgins continued, her jaw working, "that curb appeal is the single most significant factor in current market valuations." She paused. She looked me in the eye. It clearly physically pained her to continue. She asked me if I had the concrete report. She said it adds approximately significant value to the frontage. "Is that so?" I asked. She also asked, Mrs. Higgins swallowed hard, who the contractor was. She wants to put them on her preferred vendor list. The silence stretched. Mr. Henderson was leaning forward so far he was about to tip over. "Well," Mrs. Higgins snapped, regaining some of her fire, "who was it? I saw the machine. It wasn't yours. I know you don't own commercial-grade equipment." "I rented it," I said, "from a specialist." "It was effective," she admitted. She looked down at a stubborn oil stain on the street that I had missed. "Aggressive, but effective." The noise, however, was unacceptable. "It was emergency remediation," I reminded her. "But I'm glad the result is satisfactory." "It is acceptable," she corrected. "It is uniform. That is the important thing. Uniformity." She dug into her pocket. I flinched, expecting a laminated note. Instead, she pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't laminated. It was a check. She thrust it at me. "I do not accept charity," she said stiffly, "and I do not incur debts to neighbors, especially not you." I looked at the check. It was for $150. The memo line read, "Driveway maintenance, noise settlement." "Mrs. Higgins, you don't have to—" "Take it," she commanded, "and the name of the rental place." I took the check. It felt like accepting a surrender sword from a general. "Big Mike's heavy hire," I said. "Ask for the tsunami, but Mrs. Higgins?" "What?" "If you rent it, get the surface cleaner, the whirlybird. It saves time." She sniffed. "I do not operate heavy machinery, Mr. Miller. I hire people for that." She turned to leave, then stopped. She looked at my truck. "I see the leak has been resolved." "It dried up," I said. "Amazing how that works." "Keep an eye on it," she warned, pointing a finger at me. "Next time I won't be so lenient." "Next time I'll use the red tip," I said. She narrowed her eyes, not knowing what that meant, but sensing the threat. She turned and marched back to her fortress of beige. The neighbors exhaled. Mr. Henderson started laughing. "You crazy son of a bitch," he whispered. "You actually made her pay you for waking her up at 3 a.m. "I think we just reached a detente," I said. The rest of the day was a blur of victory laps. I returned the Tsunami 9000 to Big Mike. When I rolled the machine into the shop, Mike looked at it. It was covered in mud and glory. "How'd she do?" Mike asked, wiping grease off his hands. "Mike," I said, slapping the handle. "She's a beauty. We didn't just clean the driveway. We cleaned the soul of the neighborhood." Mike checked the hour meter. "You put 4 hard hours on this thing. You must have cleaned the whole block." "I did enough," I said. I told him the story. I told him about the police. I told him about the immediate remediation clause. Mike laughed so hard he fell off his stool. He was gasping for air, wiping tears from his eyes. "Emergency remediation," he wheezed. "Oh, that is rich. That is beautiful. You're a genius, kid. I'm Trito. You're a distinct odor genius." He didn't charge me for the detergent. He said it was on the house for the cause. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years. The check from Mrs. Higgins was in my pocket. I wasn't going to cash it. I was going to frame it. I was going to laminate it. When I pulled back into the cul-de-sac, the sun was setting. The driveways were still gleaming, 2 twin runways glowing in the twilight. I parked the truck. I got out. I checked underneath. Dry. I walked to the mailbox. I had mail. It was a flyer from the HOA. Upcoming community vote. Proposal to standardizing driveway cleanliness standards. Proposed by Brenda Higgins. I laughed. She was doubling down. Now that she had the cleanest driveway, she was going to make sure everyone else had to match it. I walked up my path, shaking my head. I sat on the porch steps, enjoying the cool evening air. Then, I heard a rumble. It was a deep, throaty diesel rumble. It grew louder. A large flatbed truck turned the corner into the cul-de-sac. It was Big Mike's delivery truck. I sat up. What was Mike doing here? The truck slowed down. It hissed its air brakes. It pulled up to the curb, directly in front of 401 Oakwood Lane. I watched, mesmerized. The driver door opened. A guy jumped out. Not Mike, but one of his crew. He walked to the back and lowered the liftgate. He unloaded a pressure washer. But not the Tsunami 9000. This was a trailer-mounted unit, a beast, a hot water unit used for stripping graffiti and industrial sanitation. Then, he unloaded a massive extension ladder. Then, he unloaded several jugs of Siding Begone, or whatever the chemical equivalent of a nuke was. Mrs. Higgins came out of her house. She was holding a clipboard. She pointed at her roof. She pointed at her siding. She pointed at her brick mailbox. She was going for the full detail. The guy nodded. He fired up the trailer unit. It was louder than the Tsunami. It sounded like a jet taking off. Mrs. Higgins looked across the street. She saw me sitting on my porch. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just tapped her clipboard, pointed to her house, and then pointed to mine. The message was clear. I see your clean driveway and I raise you a clean house. The game was still on. I took a sip of my beer. The noise was deafening. The smell of bleach was already drifting across the street. It was going to be a loud night. I pulled out my phone. I opened Google. How much does it cost to sandblast a brick house? I smiled. Your move? Brenda, I whispered. Your move.